So and that's it.
It's done.
And you are done.
So we're going to go ahead and get started now. Let's begin today's program entitled Setting Development Goals for Population Dynamics and Reproductive Rights. My name is Sandeep Patala, and I'm a Senior Program Associate here at the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The program is 19 years old, and we look at the various connections between health, environment, livelihoods, population, and security. Today's event is brought to you today as part of our HELPS projects. HELPS is a 5-year effort generously funded by USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health. As many as you know, I see a lot of familiar faces here. The Wilson Center is a formal memorial to our 28th president, the only president thus far to have achieved a PhD. Here at the Wilson Center, we aim to bring the worlds of policy, practice, and academia together to gain a better understanding of how to inform each other. You have folks' bios in front of you, so I'd want to direct your attention now to our moderator and 3 speakers. Suzanne Ehlers is the president and CEO of Population Action International. We have John May, who's a visiting fellow with the Center for Global Development and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. We have joining us via Skype, Kelly Castagnaro, Senior Communications Officer at International Planned Parenthood Federation, the Western Hemisphere region. And we have Beth Schlachter, Program Population Policy Advisor at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the U.S. Department of State. I do want to make a note about today's meeting. It's being recorded, so when we do come to the discussion, I ask that you use a mic, and my colleagues will come around if you do have a question. It's also important to use a mic today so that Kelly can hear us from her Skype location. When you do have the mic in hand, please introduce yourself and your affiliation. And I will turn it now over to Suzanne. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandeep, and to the ECSP program for hosting such an incredible series of conversations and events over the last several years, and looking forward to a new set of them in 2013. And Happy New Year to many of you, familiar faces in the room, but also some new ones. I'm proud to moderate this panel today and delighted to have been asked. I serve as the president and CEO of Population Action International. We're based here in Washington, D.C. We're nearing our 50th anniversary. Is that right? I'm looking at Bob Engelman. I said 50, and I thought, yeah, it's about 50. And we are a policy and research shop that's looking at the centrality of sexual and reproductive health and rights to development goals. Importantly, we look at a variety of other development issues and the way in which they interact with sexual and reproductive health and rights in order to build new collaborations and unusual partnerships to advance common agendas across the development arena. So it's a pleasure to be here. To set the stage, and if I understand correctly, this conversation was first sort of thought about as early as last summer, immediately following Rio, and some of the disappointment that many of us in the room might have felt following Rio, to the degree that reproductive rights and some of the other pieces of the sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda didn't feature as robustly and prominently within the Rio document and outcome materials. So we started thinking about what such a panel conversation would be, and it's taken us a couple of months, but I think it's a great way to kick off the new year. In addition to the Rio follow-on, we of course have ICPD, kind of beyond 2014, that's in the offing. We have the MDGs beyond 2015 process. We have these SDGs that are out there, the Sustainable Development Goals. And if I can speak for the crowd, I'm sure you or many of you feel like I do, is that it's hard to get a handle on what all these different parallel processes mean, where your most strategic entry points might be. How is it that we sort of support and advance the sexual and reproductive rights, health and rights agenda within that, but also want to push the kind of entire global health arena forward, and also the international development and the sort of movement to eradicate poverty forward. So how do you balance your sort of passion for a particular sector within a larger set of responsibilities to the global health world and to the international development world? It's something that PAI is certainly struggling with in this new year as we work to implement a new strategic plan for us, and it's certainly a problem that we'll be pondering over with many of you in the room as this year and the next couple of years unfold. So what's great is that we have, I think, a fantastic panel assembled today that's going to bring three very different perspectives to the way in which reproductive health and rights are either sort of part of these processes or could be more part of these processes, where we have strategic entry points, where we don't have them but should, and where we're not taking advantage and where we're probably already behind the 8 ball in advancing this conversation. And so hopefully we leave here with a sense of urgency and some action. I'm only the moderator, but I am a moderator who rules with an iron fist. So I have already talked to my panelists about their time limits. I've got a couple of questions queued up for each of them after their presentations in an effort to maybe illuminate a piece of the presentation that they couldn't go into greater detail about, or even a part of the presentation that they're leaving out because they know I'm going to set them up for a question just to sort of bring out one more piece. And then I hope we can open it up for a really robust question and answer. And we should have, if we do play our cards right, we should have about a good hour for that. So the order of the day, we're going to start with John May. And as Sandeep already alluded, he's got an illustrious set of associations, starting with the World Bank, but now with CGD, PRB, and Georgetown, Hoyas. So wearing a variety of different hats, and he's got his book, which is about 9 months old, he tells me, a typical gestation period, world population policies. So he's going to set the stage and I think tell the story of how fragmented and complicated the sort of current story of world demographics is. So with that kind of academic overview and underpinning, we're then going to move to Skype, and I ask for your patience. Technology typically works at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and but it does require a little bit of extra kind of give and take on part of the audience, and that's Kelly Castagnaro from the IPPF Western Hemisphere office in New York. I know many of you may know that their offices were really badly impacted after Sandy, and so that office has been trying to regroup itself and staff working from a variety of different locations. So Kelly, thanks for joining us, and she's bringing that perspective of civil society, and of course the IPPF, amazing federation of member associations around the world that are doing direct service provision, but also advocacy in defense of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And then we'll round out the panel with Beth Schlachter from the Population, Refugees, and Migration Division at the State Department. She's a senior population policy advisor. I've had the good privilege and honor of serving on the U.S. government's delegation to the last 3 commissions on population and development, and have learned an enormous amount from watching her in action, both negotiation skills, diplomacy, and really putting forward a strong U.S. government position for an issue that we all care so deeply and passionately about. And she'll be talking a bit about what that role looks like in the processes that we have ahead of us. So without further ado, I turn it over to John May. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Sandeep, for organizing this event. Unfortunately, the book that was mentioned took more than 9 months to produce. It was a long effort, about 17 years and 6 years in writing. Also, when I prepared those slides, I was working at the Center for Global Development. I am still a visiting fellow there, but now I am based at the Population Reference Bureau back there, and I spend a lot of time there working on the book, actually. I would like today to try to give a framework about this issue that we have in front of us. And first of all, I would like to zoom on the population dynamics and how diverse and different they are today. And then I would like to, on the second part, to look at the reproductive rights and the reproductive health and this new paradigm that has been prepared at the Cairo conference in '94. And finally, in the third and concluding part, I would like to set some ideas to move forward. I don't have answers and solutions. I'm just going to give you food for thought to chart the future. On the first part of the presentation, the population dynamics, what's really striking, I believe, it's the fact that we have a lot of new challenges. And one of them, it's really great divergence in the fertility levels. It's quite amazing. The world we are living in today, it's very, very diverse, just if you take fertility. And 16% of the world population is still in high fertility countries, 4 children per woman. TFR stands for total fertility rate. And they are mainly in the least developed countries, mostly Africa, but not only. and they are growing at a fast pace, 2.5–3% per year, doubling time in about 30–35 years. Now the next group, it's a group which is in between in terms of fertility, between 4 and 2.1, the famous 2.1, which is the replacement level of fertility. And that's about 38% of the world population, a bunch of different countries, and they are still going through the demographic transition, and Pakistan is one of them, 3.6 fertility right now. And finally, a big group that's sometimes overlooked, 46% of the world now, lives in countries where the total fertility rate is below replacement level, which is quite amazing. It's North America, this country, Canada, Europe, China, and some Asian countries. Not, of course, you know about Russia, Bulgaria, the Eastern European countries. And these countries will face different problems. They will face aging, depopulation eventually, and President Putin speaks always about the population issues when he addresses the nation at the Duma. The next slide, it's a map of fertility, and you see that indeed Africa is really the outlier now in terms of fertility transition in the world. And there are also a bloc, Afghanistan and Pakistan, which are still fairly high fertility countries. Today now Pakistan is at 3.6, but when this was prepared was still at 4 and above. And what the consequence will be is that the age structure is going to be totally different. And the key issue, I think, in this transformation of the fertility decline and the fertility transition is that the age structure changes. And on the left you have Niger, and then in the middle the United States, which is also impacted because of immigration, including the speaker. And finally Korea, which is a very different type of situation and is going to face a very dramatic population aging and eventually depopulation. Now, in the high fertility countries, we have the issue of the youth bulge and the security demography, and I know that the Wilson Center has done a lot of work in this area with people like Rich Sinkota and others. And the proportion, the definition is that when the proportion of the 15 to 29 represent more than 40% of all adults above age 15, then you have an issue with the youth bulge. Again, Pakistan today, 46%, and Egypt, I think it's 43%. Another issue that we have, and that's to show you how complex the world has become, is the urbanization. And the world became more urban in 2009, and 2/3 of the world will live in urban areas in 2050. And we have a huge issues with slum, about 1 billion people. And of course, they don't stay in slums forever. They may graduate and go to other urban areas, but it's a big issue. Now, the definition of urban areas, of course, is very diverse again. And some cities like Shanghai are considered as urban, and so are small cities in other countries where the definition is very different. If you have 100 people living together, you have an urban city. The slum, as I said, is a big issue, and I try to illustrate that here. Now, on top of this, you have the international migration issue, and today we have about 3% of the world's population as international migrants, people who live elsewhere than the place they were born. And this population will increase, of course, despite the economic recession that we live in, and so will tension around the international migration issues. Today, the European Union is spending more money on protecting the borders, the Frontex program, than actually giving assistance money to the countries where the migrants come from. Another issue, especially when fertility is very low, is the population aging. And I take here some calculations from the Population Reference Bureau on the elderly support ratio. And I take the example of Germany, where you have today about 3 persons age 15 to 64 for every person above 65. And then in 2050, that will become only 2 persons. And you have depopulation in some countries, and I have mentioned Russia, which is very much in the news now because they are giving passports to French people. Perhaps the French people will give passports to the Pussy Riots. Now, that was the first part of the presentation, trying to really look at these diverse, fragmented, very, very interesting landscape. So population issues are not over, but they are very different than they were before. Now I would like to move into the second part, which is the reproductive health part, the reproductive rights. And I think it was a sea change in the paradigm. And first of all, we have to acknowledge that there had been in the past abuses about family planning. We all know the period of emergency in India, 75, 77, the one-child policy in China, 79, some abuses in Latin America, like Peru. It was a time of top-down approaches, a time of target setting. And I think 2 major factors help to change that mindset. One is that there was a reaction against those family planning past abuses. And people were really concerned about human rights, about the freedom of choice, etc. But also there was the realization that family planning was a necessary but not sufficient condition to bring change. I think it was kind of clear that family planning alone was not going to do the trick. And again, going back to Pakistan compared to Bangladesh, for instance, Bangladesh, the program worked fairly well. Pakistan didn't work that well at the time. And this resulted, these 2 pieces, I think, resulted in the reproductive rights agenda, which was adopted and crafted at the ICPD, International Conference on Population and Development, in Cairo in September '94. Of course, the reproductive health is a very big beast with many, many different priorities. I think there were 14 or even 18 or 19 at the time it was crafted. I tried to bring them a bit, to narrow them a little bit, and it's the hand of reproductive health with 5 fingers: HIV/AIDS, family planning, maternal health, domestic violence, and child health. And I think with these 5 fingers, you capture quite a lot of reproductive health. Then, of course, in the Millennium Development Goals, I think we missed the boat because in 2000 it was left out, but then it was included back thanks to the work of Stan Bernstein and others, and that was the target 5B. And but also it was recognized that we need to address population and reproductive health issues also in the next development framework. And I was recently in New York on a meeting to try to prepare for that. And that leads me to the third and the last part of this presentation, which is the way forward. What can we do? What should we do? What should we think about? And as I said, I'm going to give you some food for thought. I'm not going to give you all the answers. I don't have them. So setting the development goals and the way forward. The first thing I believe it's very important is the inequity and the poverty. And I think we see that we have a lot of changes, but the analysis of the DHSs by quintiles, as you may be familiar, has really helped to understand better the inequity, what's different. If you take the richest quintile in Bolivia, they have demographic indicators which are very familiar to industrialized countries, but the low quintiles are very, very different. And the rapid population growth seems now to be linked to really poverty at the household level. It's more difficult to have a linkage between high fertility and poverty more globally, but at the household level, that seems to be established now. Now, the other issue that's much talked about these days is demographic dividends. And this might be a bit of a sky in the pie. Let me explain. First of all, the demographic dividend is obtained when you have the working population, which becomes relatively larger than before, and the dependency ratio especially are becoming more favorable. And then you have an opportunity for faster economic growth, and like it was established in East Asia, but also you need to have sound economic and social policies to capture these demographic dividends. And the window of opportunity is limited in time. But that's, might be, as I said, a bit of a sky in the pie, because you need those other policies to be able to capture the demographic dividends. If your demography is moving the right direction, is not enough. Now, some of the way forward areas or paths to move forward I would like to explore briefly. First of all, the need for a multi-sectoral approach. I don't think we can do just family planning alone. We have to do it with the female education, income-generating activities. We need to empower the women, and we need also to build the human capital, education and health. We need also, importantly, to talk about the priority groups, the women and their partners. They represent half of the population. They're absolutely key. And of course, the youth in many least developed countries, 30% of the population now is between 15 and 29. Finally, and this is very important, is a political commitment. I think it's absolutely crucial. We had the example of Tunisia with the President Bourguiba. We have the example today of President Kagame in Rwanda and some other countries as well. Need for more advocacy at the highest level. I like the concept of public demography, which was developed by Peter Donaldson at the Population Council, where you really try to convey key messages to policy leaders, and you have to convey them in a simple way. And that might be challenging because a lot of people don't know. And I will conclude with just one example. German policymakers believe that if they bring back fertility at the level of 2.1, which is replacement, they will be fine and everything will be fine. Actually, it's not going to happen because Germany had below 1.5 fertility for the last 40 years. So the population pyramid is damaged. It's not going to be fixed that easily. Thank you very much.
And now, Kelly, if you can hear us.
Yeah.
Okay, it's all yours.
Okay. Thanks, Suzanne, and thanks, Sandeep. It's wonderful to be here today, albeit virtually. I'm still waiting for my sandwich through Skype, so whenever you can get that through, that would be great. But I was particularly excited to address the role that sexual and reproductive rights and health should play in the next global development agenda, as this is an issue that continues to be a focus for my organization, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, Western Hemisphere region. In recent decades, the international development agenda has changed dramatically. Historic UN conferences and summits throughout the 90s and 2000s, including the Watershed ICPD that John mentioned in his remarks, established a... Oops. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Established a broad and rights-based approach to achieving sustainable development, eradicating poverty, and achieving global well-being. And we believe that sexual and reproductive health and rights are central to achieving this vision. We believe that when everyone has access to sexual and reproductive health, the right to bodily integrity, and control over all matters related to sexuality, sustainable development, health, and gender equality will be achieved. And since Cairo, millions of lives have been saved and changed through the provision of reproductive health services. And in many parts of the world, laws and policies are in place to protect reproductive rights and prevent discrimination. However, despite these advances, challenges still remain. As I speak, many continue to face discrimination, coercion, and violence when it comes to making decisions about sex and reproduction. Too many couples cannot exercise their right to determine freely and responsibly the number and spacing of their children. And at the same time, global funding for sexual and reproductive rights and health has decreased radically at the same moment when more than 200 million women and girls worldwide lack access to the contraceptives they want to use. So today I'd like to talk about two key issues that hamper access to sexual and reproductive rights and health in our region, and two that we see as key to sort of thinking about the next iteration of sustainable development. And the first is the deep inequality present throughout our region, which John alluded to in his remarks. And the second is the discrimination and stigma that many continue to face in accessing the health services they need, want, and deserve. So first I'll turn to inequality. In Latin America and the Caribbean, income differences between rich and poor are scandalous. A recent report by the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean notes that in our region, income received by the four poorest deciles is on average less than 15% of total income, while the richest decile receives about a third of total income. This inequality manifests itself in all spheres of life, and health is a clear example. The Inter-American Development Bank shows a strong correlation between inequality in income distribution and inequality in access to health services, and sexual and reproductive health sadly does not escape this reality. In Guatemala, for example, where indigenous groups account for 40% of the total population and 75% of its poor, nearly 40% of married indigenous women have an unmet need for family planning, in comparison to 22% of non-indigenous women. And this is also true in newly industrialized countries such as Mexico, where mortality has decreased steadily since the 1950s, but still national statistics mask glaring inequalities seen on the ground, inequalities that continue to divide the country along lines of class, ethnicity, and geography. In Oaxaca, for example, where 53% of the population lives in rural areas, indigenous women and rural communities face acute health challenges on many fronts because of poverty, poor education, and a dire shortage of medical staff and services. In 2008, for example, there were 57 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births in Mexico, a ratio that is 5 times that of other industrialized countries. But the maternal mortality ratio in the least developed region of the country, which comprises the states of Guerrero, Oaxaca, and Chiapas, is 97 per 100,000 live births, which is almost double the national average. Such regional disparities are often due to an uneven distribution of healthcare resources and providers, as well as the failure of national health systems to reach the most rural and remote communities. I'd now like to move to the second major challenge in our region in ensuring the sexual and reproductive health and rights in all, and that is the stigma and discrimination that many face, both at the community and the health system levels, in accessing health services, information, and contraception. And as John sort of talked about the changing global demographics, I'd like to focus on the barriers felt by young people throughout the region. The rate of teen pregnancy in Latin America and the Caribbean is one of the highest in the world, just below that of sub-Saharan Africa. In our region, nearly 40% of women become pregnant before the age 20, and nearly 20% of births are to teenage mothers. Moreover, the number of adolescents between 15 and 19 who are mothers is growing in some countries. And as is usually the case, inequality is present in these problems as well. Pregnancy rates are 3 to 5 times higher among poor adolescents. All young people need the information and services to avoid unwanted pregnancies and take control of their health. They need information to make decisions about their sexuality and the number of children they'll have and when. But in most societies, there's still a marked reluctance to acknowledge young people's rights, and an equally strong denial to recognize them as sexual beings capable of making their own decisions. This lack of recognition, coupled with the lack of adequate policies to ensure the exercise of these rights, greatly hampers their access to education and services and endangers their health. I'd like to give now an example. In Peru, legislation enacted in 2006 was enacted to penalize the rape and sexual abuse of adolescents. But this law has had negative effects on the health and well-being of young people. And while the protection of young people against rape and sexual assault is obviously a key step to ensuring the well-being of young people, this law also criminalized sexual relationships between adolescents of 14 and 18 years of age. Consequently, the legal penalizations impose serious obstacles for young people to access these information and services. I could speak for hours on how this law has negatively impacted young people's health and access to services, but I'd like to share two quotations from two adolescents in Peru about what this law has meant in their lives. And the first one's from a 15-year-old adolescent mother. I had heard about this law and was scared that the government would take away my baby. I was frightened to go to the hospital because I was scared they would take my baby away when I give birth or send me to a communal housing where I could no longer care for him and would be punished. And another 17-year-old said, if you go to receive health services, they will detain you and your partner will go to jail because having sex is a violation of the law, even if you have agreed to have sex with that person. And similarly, statistics show that since the passage of this law, the sexual and reproductive health and well-being of young people has declined. Between 2006, the year the law was passed, and 2009, the overall rates of teen pregnancies has increased among both rural and urban youth, with a nearly 50% increase in pregnancies among young women without education. Against this backdrop, our local member association in Peru, INAPARES, has worked closely with civil society organizations to challenge this penal code law as an unconstitutional violation of adolescents' rights to health care and age non-discrimination in accessing health. While civil society organizations like INAPARES and proceeded with the legal negotiations, Peruvian young people decided to test their constitutional power. INAPARES' youth groups across the country joined forces to raise awareness of this issue among both adults and young people. They needed 5,000 signatures from Peruvian citizens to file a motion to overturn the law, and collected more than 15,000 in the end. So recently they were able to bring this, a few years ago, they were able to bring this challenge to the Peru High Constitutional Court. And the really exciting thing for us is after years of waiting for a decision, just this week the court ruled this law unconstitutional and repealed it. This was a huge victory for INAPARES and the youth that worked so hard to gather these signatures, but more so a huge victory for young people in accessing the services they need without fear of jail or stigma and discrimination. Equally important, I think this example offers a key lesson in how to move forward with the crafting of the next set of global development policies. Oftentimes, civil society groups are expected to make sure that abuses do not occur and expected to reach the most rural and marginalized communities with health services. However, they are given neither the resources nor the authority to adequately carry out this work and hold their governments accountable to the international agreements they signed and affirmed. I think going forward, sustained investments in civil society organizations, including youth organizations, that know the realities of the barriers to access to care and rights, that can monitor the implementation of programs and policies and hold their governments accountable is key. Also key is ensuring their full participation in the development of the next iteration of Sustainable Development Goals. As Suzanne mentioned, the next few years will see the end of a series of international commitments and the development of a new paradigm for global development. This presents us with an unparalleled opportunity to secure a world of justice, choice, and well-being for all people, which will ultimately lead to a sustainable and just planet. IPPF has prioritized this work, and we are inviting partners and supporters to join us in working together to ensure that health and rights become a reality for all in every community around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. You did a great job from your remote location. You came through crystal clear, and really appreciate your already drawing linkages between the remarks that John May delivered and zeroing in a bit on the region where you work and giving us some very concrete country examples, which we know the national reality, in order for the global development frameworks to be robust and have integrity, really have to reflect those national realities. And Kelly's done a beautiful job of outlining some of the tough stories in that region, but also some recent successes as well. So, Beth, please.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Sandeep, for having me today, and to the Wilson Center for organizing today's event. As you've just heard, the State Department Bureau where I work, Population, Refugees, and Migration, has the department's policy lead on policy issues. So I thought that perhaps the most relevant and I hope interesting aspect of our work for you all here today would be to hear about our efforts in multilateral fora to promote fact-based and forward-leaning population policies that are founded on support for sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. The U.S. government's in the early stages of considering our positions on the post-2015 development framework, so my comments today reflect the perspectives of my office and not of that conversation overall. In my remarks today, I'll speak about the Obama administration's support for sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. And instead of saying that phrase over and over again, I'm just going to go to SRH or maybe reproductive rights, so we don't have to hear that over and over, including how these issues may be included in the 2015 development framework. Then I'll speak about recent international negotiations, including both challenges and successes, and ongoing and upcoming review processes and the opportunities they present to further solidify the integration of population dynamics and SRH and reproductive rights, which are so central to reaching our development goals. I'd like to start by stating emphatically that since addressing global inequality and inequity are our overarching principles in revising the MDGs, we must focus on health inequities to have a meaning and lasting impact on human development. And for the most vulnerable, women and girls, that means that we must focus on sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. In doing so, however, I think it's very important that we ask ourselves what it means to have rights-based policies for women and girls who are living in the lowest income countries, where the largest gaps exist in reaching the MDGs. In fact, I was surprised to learn recently that among the most fragile states, none of those countries have reached any of the Millennium Development Goals. So how will we address this massive inequity, especially considering the instability of the most vulnerable regions and countries? Mortality and morbidity related to SRH, particularly for women and adolescent girls, are still unacceptably high in many regions of the world. These illnesses and deaths occur in the prime years of life and have lifelong consequences for women and girls and their families who suffer the direct health and economic consequences. Poor SRH also have a negative impact on the overall health and viability of communities, with significant implications for sustainable development because of the lost opportunity for education, reduced labor productivity, and related changes to population size and structure, as John so eloquently described. The unfinished work of MDG 5 must be addressed in the post-2015 development framework, as lack of access to sexual and reproductive health care is one of the greatest moral, human rights, and development challenges of our time, and is the world's largest health inequity. As a starting point, we must continue to advocate for SRH, including universal access to voluntary family planning, as life-saving interventions that are essential for promoting health, economic growth, and development across the globe, and ultimately for ensuring that all women are able to exercise their human rights. Individuals are at the heart of the post-2015 framework. Whether we succeed or fail depends on our ability to empower people, particularly women and young people, to make decisions for themselves. I'd like now to present some of the options on the table for how these issues might be addressed in the new framework. For example, experts are currently considering whether there should be a specific goal on gender, or whether gender should be integrated across the other goals, or whether both of these should exist. They're also considering how to handle health, as the MDGs, as you all know, included 3 separate goals related to specific health issues. Will the post-2015 framework push these same goals forward? And if so, will they remain individual goals, or will they be captured under one goal as separate indicators? Another point for consideration is where SRH should be positioned, with options including placing it under whatever gender goal is devised, or perhaps under health. It's vitally important that advocates such as you all today participate in that discussion. Now's a good time, if you're not already engaged, to do so. We all understand, especially after Professor May's presentation again, that global health or global population in future years will be decided by the policies we adopt today. It'll matter a great deal if we reach 9 billion in 2050 or if we reach 10 billion, and of course both options are still possible. Future population growth and resulting population dynamics will be influenced by today's policies, so it's incumbent upon our advocacy community to ensure that population dynamics and their linkages to rights-based programs are well understood by experts in other fields as well, such as climate change experts, agricultural specialists, those working on access to sustainable supply of clean water, and those in the education field, among others. We will lose an important opportunity to increase the understanding among all development experts of the centrality of SRH if we don't reach out to these communities now to articulate the impact of population change on their work. In order to understand the role that population dynamics and reproductive health should play in whatever framework is developed, it's also important to look at the range of international processes that will take place over the next few years. These include the 20-year reviews of the 1994 ICPD in Cairo, the Beijing Platform for Action, as well as the outcome documents and resolutions of the annual sessions of the Commission on Population and Development, CPD, the Commission on the Status of Women, which is CSW, and the issue-specific resolutions that will come out of the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, among others. These negotiation processes will form the background to the post-2015 discussions, so their outcomes are vitally important. We're at a critical point because in 2012 we faced considerable challenges in reaffirming global support for our issues. The U.S. and other like-minded delegations who want to see strong language linking SRH and reproductive rights to development faced a vocal and well-coordinated opposition. Yet even given these regressive forces, we experienced some notable successes and admittedly some disappointments as well. For example, the CSW last year has only twice failed to achieve a negotiated outcome document. The second time was just last year, where member states failed to reach consensus over previously agreed language on SRH and reproductive rights. And as many of you may know, this year the 57th session, which will start in March, has for its priority theme violence against women. And the first time the CSW failed to reach consensus was over violence against women a number of years ago. So we have an interesting combination to confront when we meet in a couple of months. But happily, we have very senior level engagement from the government at this point. AVAWA experts, the Violence Against Women Act people that are in the NSS and others are deeply engaged in our preparations. And the international community is very invested in seeing a positive outcome this time and not coming away without consensus. So we're hoping that this intense organization and the participation of civil society organizations such as yours will help get us across that threshold this time, because none of us want to imagine having 2 years in a row without agreed conclusions in the CSW. A month after last year's CSW, however, the CPD, the Commission on Population and Development, adopted a forward-leaning resolution containing strong commitments to action on adolescents and youth that significantly advances our understanding on adolescent sexual and reproductive health and human rights. The resolution provides a framework for action on the health, development, and human rights of the largest ever population aged 10 to 24. And it's based on evidence of the realities of the lives of young people and the policies and programs that effectively reach them rather than ideology. The resolution also reflects the issues and demands put forward by young people worldwide over the last several years, and their participation in CPD was an important part of our success. Liz Beyer from USAID is here, and she was part of that delegation and part of the really great and well-connected network of young people that helped us to put pressure where we needed it in order to get the cooperation we needed from some member states who maybe had policies that reflected what we were going for in the CPD, but weren't necessarily negotiating from that point. So Liz and her cohort were incredibly helpful to getting us where we needed to be. Over the course of several months of negotiations in advance of the Rio Conference on Sustainable Development, we faced an uphill climb to ensure a strong declarative statement that population dynamics undergird our ability to reach our development goals. One of the reasons these commissions and meetings continue to be so challenging is that they can sometimes seem to address SRH and other issues that have a direct impact on women as if they are separate from development issues. For example, civil society advocates for women's empowerment prioritize strong representation at the annual meeting of the CSW, but it can be difficult to attract the attention of CSOs who rely on empowered women to achieve their programs in related fields, such as environment and climate change advocates, who are perhaps not aware of the linkage between their work and that of the CSW. Therefore, member states that are uncomfortable addressing progressive ideologies that may empower women are able to isolate specific issues that are more challenging for their governments and push back against those who seek to advance global normative standards. The discussion around the post-2015 development framework provides a unique opportunity to pull together various development actors and assess together across fields how we can support real and lasting change. We had our first swing at that during last summer's Rio conference because the first draft of that outcome document didn't even have a chapter on health. So it took a lot of work to get to that endpoint. In the end, the Rio document made the case that economies cannot effectively maximize sustainable development if over half their population is not thoroughly integrated into their strategies and aims. The document also underscored the importance of women to achieving sustainable development, prioritized measures to promote gender equality and women's empowerment, and committed to creating change that will improve the situation of women and girls everywhere. And though the document contains some helpful language on sexual and reproductive health, unfortunately, negotiators were not successful in their efforts to reaffirm reproductive rights within the context of sustainable development. It's clear that we can do better, and we should. Even the gains that we did manage to make in Rio would not have been possible without the work of reproductive health CSOs who reinforced these points to advocates in other fields and to representatives from other member states. Rio is an excellent example of how working together, like-minded member states and CSOs can accomplish much more than either can do on their own. Across the board, it's clear we need strong leadership and enhanced understanding of these challenges in order to continue to make progress. UN agencies depend on the normative standards put forth through the annual cycle of General Assembly and Human Rights Council resolutions, as well as the review commissions such as CPD and CSW. The leadership of these organizations, such as the UN Population Fund, UN Women, and UNICEF, must be firm and united in their support of fundamental principles such as reproductive rights in order to effectively implement their mandates and programs. The collective support and commitment of governments, advocates, CSOs, and multilateral organizations is essential to ensuring that today's girls and boys live in a tomorrow that holds out great promise, of individuals who are free to decide for themselves on matters of their own sexuality, of strong, healthy families, and of thriving communities and nations. That's the world we want, and what the U.S. government, through promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights for all, is working to achieve. Thank you.
Great, thank you to all panelists. I barely even had to use I didn't actually have to use my time cards at all. So thank you all for staying within the time limits because it gives us a healthy amount of time for question and answer and discussion. As I suggested earlier, I have a couple of questions that I'm gonna put out there first to speakers and then open it up. So be thinking of what issues, additional issues that you would like explored in more depth or further illuminated. And I'll just start in the order that the speakers went. And so, John, if I could start with you. And it's a great follow-on to the presentation that Beth just gave about the variety of different commission meetings. And this year, in 2013, the Commission on Population and Development, which will meet in mid-April, has its theme of international migration. And you talked a bit about international migration and some of the tensions that are sort of sure to arise. So for those of us in the room that are interested in advocacy around sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights within the context of the UN CPD, what advice or counsel would you give us for how this issue intersects with international migration in a way that we can help member states of all stripes work together to promote as progressive an agenda and as strong of agreed conclusions as possible coming out of this year's session?
Wow. What should I do?
I think it's ready to,
Yeah.
it's just on.
That's a difficult question. Well, first of all, I would like to say that, as I mentioned, despite we call it the Great Recession since 2008, that has dampened a little bit the migration flows, but I assume that with the economy starting to picking up again, especially in this country, it's not so much the case in Western Europe, and maybe the economy will slow down in Asia and China somewhat, but I think the migration flows will continue to be very important. So we are going to live in a world where there will be not just 3.1 or 3.2% of international migrants, but there will be 4, 5, whatever. That will keep growing. In my book, in the last chapter on the prospects, I made a pitch among the priority groups to identify the migrants as a group that needs more protection on the rights, on human rights especially, because there are many diverse aspects to international migration. You have the professional migrants, computer people from India going to Silicon Valley, but you have also migrants sponsored by their own governments, like Filipinos going to the Gulf. Then you have a lot of refugees, you have illegal migrants. So it's a galaxy. Migration is not just one category of people. So how these would intersect with what we are trying to address, which is reproductive health and rights, I think the entry point, in my view, would be the right. You have to guarantee a minimum rights to the international migrants. And that has not always been the case. Now, there are many other issues before we reach the point where we can really address the rights of migrants, and then including their reproductive rights, is that we don't have a lot of information on migration. And I think Hania Zlotnik, who used to head the population division, she's a migration specialist, and she's really making the point to have more data, to collect more data. And there are a lot of initiatives now on the table to try to do better on collecting migration data. And I think the Center for Global Development also made a pitch on this. Now, the last point I would like to make, we have been talking, and I'm very glad that the State Department is here, and especially on the refugees, because we live in a world where you have, on one hand, you have family planners, and they do family planning, and then you have people dealing with the refugees, and you have the UN refugee commissions, but we barely talk to each other. We never talk to each other. So we are spending a lot of money. I'm not going to point fingers here, but we spend a huge amount of monies on refugee camps, on emergency assistance, etc. But if we had a dialogue with the planners, the policymakers in the countries, there are a lot of things we could do to avoid some of these situations in the first place, and then to try to mitigate the bad situations that we do have. So we are talking about the multi-sectoral, we are talking about working together, And I think that's one example that we don't do enough on this count, because the refugee, the galaxy of the refugee people organization, and they do a huge amount of work, and they spend a huge amount of resources, but we really don't know what's going on. And I for one example, I know that some cooperative agencies of the USAID, I think it's John Snow, I'm not sure, we need to double check that, but they have been providing reproductive health services to refugee camps. And so they have been able to cross that border to reach out to the refugee community, so to speak. Now, to conclude, I would like to throw another example, which I didn't have time to touch on my 15 minutes, because I didn't want to receive the -5 little cards. I was recently, September, at Berkeley, and they organized a conference on the Sahel. And they had a very fancy acronym, which is OASIS. I don't know for what it stands, but it's a nice concept to have an oasis in the Sahel. And for the first time, they put agriculture people, they put climate change, they put demographers, they put women's rights people, they put human rights, community-based workers, and I think it's illuminating, because again we are in our silos. We are, I'm just a plain demographer doing my little projections, and then I don't know exactly what's going on the climate, and I don't know what's going on the agriculture, on the global warming. I think we need to bridge to other fields and to really have the word is used, but I mean a holistic approach to many problems. So I will stop here because I will get my little card.
Thank you for that. And it's already true that in the preparations for this year's CPD, that we, under the leadership of PRM, have been pulled together in conversations between very many different constituencies and communities, and we're already starting to learn from each other and realizing how little we talk to each other between the migrants community and the reproductive health and rights community, and those who are working on young people and those who are working on human rights more broadly. So you've illuminated really, I think, a key issue for our preparations in the next few months. Kelly, are you with me?
I am.
Well, I have a question for you. I'm going to give you two options. I know both of these issues are ones on which IPPF Western Hemisphere works, and I think everyone in the room will recognize that both of these issues are can be exciting issues in their own right. And I would love to have you speak to us either about the issue of safe abortion or the issue of sexual rights, and how you see that issue playing out and impacting the process around these global development frameworks in this year, 2013, and beyond.
Okay, great. Yeah, so first I think it's important to just start with a broad definition of what constitutes sexual rights, because I'm aware, especially in our field, that we use so many acronyms and lingos that a lot can be lost. But IPPF's definition of sexual rights, or our vision, is constituted by a set of entitlements related to sexuality that emanate from the rights to freedom, equality, privacy, autonomy, integrity, and dignity. These include the rights to equal protection under the law, freedom from all forms of discrimination based on sex, sexuality, or gender, the right to participation for all persons regardless of the sexuality or gender, the rights to life, liberty, security of the person, and bodily integrity, and at a very basic level, the right to choose who you have sex with, whether you have sex, and when. And this set of rights seems so basic that people should be able to make decisions about their own body and their own sexuality, but throughout the world, sexual rights remain a contentious issue. And sadly, as we've seen in Uganda and we've seen in Jamaica, many gay and lesbian and transgender communities are subject to violence, discrimination, and stigma in their communities. This, of course, includes young women who are married against their will, who can't refuse sex with their much older husband. The issue of child marriage, which I think is is a little less controversial, but the stigma that all of these marginalized communities face is often always providers. And so making access to judgment-free services is a challenge for many. And I think that although the human right to have control over and decide freely and responsibly on all matters related to sexuality, free of coercion, discrimination, and violence has been recognized in several international agreements, there is no international definition of sexual rights, and I was recently at the Bali Youth Forum convened by UNFPA, which brought together young people from throughout the world. And the resulting declaration from this forum, in terms of what are their priorities for sustainable development going forward, sexual rights was at the core. I think increasingly the largest generation of young people ever feels that you can't have equality, you can't have justice, you can't have sustainable development unless these rights are recognized and actualized in local communities. And I think an emerging issue in terms of trying to set an internationally agreed to definition of sexual rights so that civil society can then take that international agreement and hold their governments responsible for fulfilling those rights. And just to mention, if you're interested in reading more, we have a sexual rights declaration, which you can access on our website at ippfwhr.org if you're interested in hearing more. Thanks.
That's great, Kelly. Thank you. Beth, a question for you, and you did such a beautiful job of really outlining what we know so far about these various processes and how the U.S. position is being developed and formed. And you also gave, I thought, a really generous shout out to civil society organizations and the work that we've done to support forward-leaning and fact-based positions, not just with the U.S. government, but with all member states. Can you give us an example or two of, from a government's perch, what some of the most effective advocacy strategies have been among civil society who is interested in these issues, where it really has supported member state positions, where it's really helped forge alliances that wouldn't have been there before, where it's really helped move conflict between or disagreement in the negotiating room forward in a very productive way? Is there an example or two you could give us of what you've seen that those of us in the room who make our daily work advocacy could learn from and do more of?
Well, I'll refer back first to my example of Liz Beyer and the youth advocates during the CPD. Prior to going to, sorry to embarrass you, Liz, to USAID, Liz came from Advocates for Youth, who have a global network of young people who are engaged on these issues. So when we came across a few stumbling blocks, as you know, it became helpful to reach out to that network and share with them some of our challenges and to see if they could mobilize from their civil society context some pressure on specific member states to help get us across the line. So that kind of network is something that we don't have from inside of the negotiating room. That kind of immediate contact that this social media network was really quite startling in terms of what they could achieve and who they could reach pretty quickly. And so I think that that's a new tool for us as well in terms of making sure that we have that kind of connectivity to advocates who can then make these reaches back to country. Because if you think about sort of the structure at the UN and who's available to participate in any of these negotiations on the part of member states, they often work in blocks. Some of the delegations are less well-funded and so have to spread very thin across a couple of different things that are happening at the same time. So who may be in the room negotiating on behalf of a large group of other member states at any given time, it fluctuates, and it may not be the person who perhaps represents the most progressive standpoint, so then being able to reach out to those other delegations as well. It's just a really important tool. So we're grateful for that. So I would hope that that would encourage others to bring their organizations to these various commissions. Having your voice and really your pressure at those events really helps us to explain on a person-by-person basis what it is that we're trying to achieve. There's so much misinformation and fear around all of these issues. And the delegates and negotiators themselves can't get to everybody. So having a broad network of CSOs that are available to maybe engage over coffee or just sit down and talk to the delegations and work through what these policies mean for them at the country level in terms of their own work, that's incredibly powerful. So the participation is something that we really rely on and we hope remains strong.
And if I could, I'll add sort of a DC filter on that question. And you started off by talking about how the U.S. is really in its early stages of figuring out what its position is. And so, keeping in mind some of the remarks you've just made, what can DC-based or sort of U.S.-focused advocates do sort of across different agencies and divisions of government to really help promote and support the strongest possible and most forward-leaning position for the U.S. government as it relates to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights in these emerging development frameworks? Advice for us sort of right here inside the Beltway.
Yeah, I think that it's really an excellent moment for you to make sure that you're heard with those people that you know within government about your perspectives on all of this. As I said, there haven't been decisions yet about the USG's position on where all of this is going to land. And so there's still an opportunity for you to have influence on what you think that framework should look like and where these issues should be positioned. We always know that there's going to be pushback on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and as John mentioned, we didn't even get that indicator until many years after,
2005.
Until 2005, after the MDGs had already been settled, so 5 years. We don't want that same situation again, and we want to make sure that SRH stands on its own. Of course, maternal health is a very important part of that, but it would be helpful if maybe things were framed not always through maternal health, but with sexual and reproductive health, and the maternal health is part of that. You could talk about how that might relate to child survival. There are lots of other ways. There are lots of ways that things are being considered. So if you have thoughts about that, I would encourage you to express those.
That's great. Sounds like an open invitation, so we should take up on that. Well, you know.
Yeah, it's not me, but
with
go ahead
good
and call
partnerships with. So at this stage, with a significant chunk of time left, I'd like to open it up to questions. I'd like you to introduce yourself and the organization that you're coming from, and I like to take 3 questions at a time, so that if your question's bad, we can kind of skip over. No, just kidding. Just 3 questions at a time to give our panelists a little bit of flexibility in how they answer, and not quite on the spot. So I see John, I see Suzanne, and I see this hand right next to my new colleague Rebecca. Yes, and then I'll take another 3 right after that.
Jason.
Yeah.
Thank the panelists, John Townsend, Population Council, and I'm also the medical advisory panel for IPPF, so it's nice to see a colleague on Skype. 3 challenges have been left unsaid in this great panel. The first is, how do we move our knowledge of population dynamics into the design of health services that are responsible for those population needs? We've always thought about contraception, but increasingly as population dynamics change, the content may include for reproductive health more focus on infertility as it relates to stigma and discrimination and women's needs, as well as the consequences of reproductive developments post-menopause, which may include reproductive cancers and other things. So that's kind of one. How do we move that? We're still, some of our programs are still designed as if they were in the 70s and 80s in terms of the definition of the problems here. The second is, where do we get these services and how do we ensure quality? We could talk about the character of population plans, but we rarely talk about public, NGO, private sector as markets. And I think markets have to do with the availability of commodities, the prices that are charged, who gets serviced, who doesn't get access, and that's a second important challenge. And the third one is who pays. And financing is critical to all these issues, and rights without money often are left on the wayside. Here we're talking about who pays in terms of subsidy, what's the insurance, what's the role of government, what's the role of direct payment of beneficiaries. That's an issue we kind of have to get into in the next 10 years, given the scale and development of population growth. And finally, it's kind of the legal systems. How do we make sure that the legal systems foster and enhance the reproductive rights of all, particularly those who are most vulnerable? I thought the case from Peru was really cogent, but we have entirely too few of those examples around the world actually to give us much hope.
So John's questions will constitute the entire next panel session at ECSP. So just as an idea for Sandeep and her team. So it's Suzanne Petroni there with the microphone.
Susan, you.
Thank you. Hi, Suzanne Petroni with the International Center for Research on Women. Thanks to all the panelists for this illuminating discussion. Beth, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Sorry.
All right.
So you started your discussion with a focus on the very rightly, the appropriately awarded emphasis that the United States has had on rights-based policies. And you were very careful also to talk about sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights, but you didn't mention sexual rights. And Kelly gave us a very good discussion of what sexual rights means to those of us in the international community. And I think it's a semantics issue on the one hand, but it really isn't. It means a lot to use that term and to have that term recognized by governments. So to me, I think what Kelly said, it comes down to the right to decide whether, when, and with whom to have sex. Something very basic, and I think something which most of us would agree with, but the United States hasn't been able to use that term in the international arena. And now we have a United Nations document, the Bali Declaration, which was not a negotiated document, but it was more than just young people coming together. 3,000 stakeholders from the youth movement, but also governments, private sector, NGOs from around the world came together, and UNFPA is calling this a United Nations document. So we have this UN document. We have the Secretary of State's very strong statements on the rights of sexual minorities, and certainly her leadership and the State Department's leadership over the years in women's rights and youth rights. And now, when you think about the cases that Kelly mentioned, Uganda, Jamaica, but also a case like the Delhi gang rape case, which is getting so much attention, that really comes down to bodily integrity and the right to say no to sex. So we have, I think, a potentially historic opportunity for the U.S. to take a strong stance on sexual rights moving forward. And I just wondered if you could illuminate us a little bit on where the United States stands in regard to that term.
Great. And one more question on this side. And remember, the shorter the question, the more time we have for multiple questions. Not naming any names, Jonathan.
Hi. I'm Melinda Kimball from the United Nations Foundation. It's great to have the panel and these comments. I want to go straight to this issue of universal health care, which WHO has kind of signaled should be a centerpiece of the next development framework. I think many of us see such a centerpiece as a way to avoid really concretizing these critical issues of rights to services and rights of choice in sexuality and sexual relations that are much more complex than just this so-called services issue caught up in universal health care. So I think this is critical because we've been led down many garden paths before, and I cannot see us, particularly after Delhi, accepting a document that doesn't underscore sexual and reproductive rights as central human rights.
Thank you, Melinda. So we have three great questions, questions that we will not be able to explore in all of the depth that they deserve. But I'm just going to go down the panel and start with John, Beth, and then Kelly. And, at your, sort of respond to the pieces of it that you can and feel you want to at this stage, and then we can follow up afterwards as well.
Thank you, Susan. I will just address the question by John. Thank you for the question. You put a lot on the table. We have a topic for the next panel, of course. But I think you are very right because we are just thinking narrowly in terms of contraceptive supply and services, but we need a much broader range of health services. You are also totally right on the financing and the subsidies and who is paying what. And on the legal system versus population and reproductive health, there are maybe two ways to look at it. One is to look at the legal system and to try to make it amenable to the provision of population and reproductive health services. But the other way to look at it is to look at it from the barrier viewpoints. What are the different legal barriers that needs to be overcome so we can have services? Again, I think you are right on the money here, because we need to translate what our visions into concrete on the ground changes to improve the situation that's what we try to do. But I cannot answer all these different topics that you raised. And it might be actually a good next panel would be how to translate the policy vision into concrete reality on the ground. It's obvious that if we don't have a functioning health system in many countries, things are not really going to move. But we need also to be creative and to really think about how to provide services. And I know the World Bank has now tried with RBF, results-based financing, and it's showing some progress in some countries, but there are many other ways to do it, and maybe a market segmentation would be useful to have, because the private sector, the pharmacies, the social marketing, the public sector, all these things should go together, provided there is an overall framework and the people know exactly what they are doing against a broader musical score, if you will, so everybody would do his part. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll start with Suzanne's question about sexual rights. So, and I'll harken back to Kelly's definition that's on the IPPF website that talks about each of the individual rights that they feel go under the umbrella of sexual rights. And individually, the U.S. government supports those rights. But as you know, there is no internationally negotiated document by member states that defines and agrees on the definition of sexual rights. And so until that time, we won't be using that phrase, because we will only use something that has a defined parameters. I'd also point you to the difficulties we have in getting the phrase reproductive rights, which is clearly defined in the ICPD and elaborated on in the Beijing Program of Action. It's difficult enough to get people to agree to include the two words reproductive rights, as we failed to do in Rio and as we had many challenges around in UNGA this year. So we will be working very hard to include reproductive rights wherever and whenever appropriate. But until the negotiations around a term for sexual rights are on the table, we won't be including that in our language, which is why you're very correct to note that I'm careful to say sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights, even though the acronym of SRHR would be oh so much easier to use. So we would be happy to engage in those negotiations at a point when they could be productive, and we look forward to that opportunity, and we'll work toward that goal ultimately, but I just don't think we're there at this point. With regard to universal health care as part of the overarching structure for the post-2015 development framework, that structure is out on the table. It's something that negotiators and those people who are working at the high level now are considering, but I'm sorry that I just don't have the information for you on where they might be going with that, but it certainly is on the table, and I know it's being considered very seriously by those people who are looking to make those decisions at this point. And I did want to go back as well to a question that John had, and then something that John said earlier about refugees and about vulnerable populations, because you're right, my bureau does manage over $2 billion worth of U.S. taxpayer money every year to support the international refugee support systems around the world, usually through UNHCR, but through ICRC and IOM and other organizations as well. And as you were talking about the difficulty of reaching those populations, I was thinking about the arguments that people have about HIV and how we can't treat our way out of HIV, the same way as we can't support our way out of the refugee crises. When you think about population growth and the vast numbers of people that will be joining us here on this earth, and that heightened competition for resources, and how that's going to result in more vulnerable situations, we can't just continue to support refugees in the various situations, although we have a moral obligation to do so, and we will be at that table. We need to address the factors that lead to instability in order to prevent those kinds of situations in the first place. So SRH is central to avoiding the kinds of situations that result in refugees. And so we see this in a holistic way. You're right that it can be sort of difficult to make that case within the UN context when we continue to look at things in a very siloed way, which is why these conversations, such as the one you mentioned at Berkeley, I think are so important, because we all need to be talking across fields in order to be more effective, or we'll just end up back in the same situation of trying to treat ourselves out of each of these situations.
Kelly, do you have some remarks that you'd like to add at this stage?
I think just to the third question about the universal access to healthcare goal, just to say that this option may seem the most politically viable. I think it is concerning in terms of how sexual and reproductive rights and health will retain visibility in the next global development agenda. Securing a target for SRH under a broader health goal would be challenging. And again, as John pointed out, the target for universal access to SRH didn't come till 5 years after the MDGs were adopted. But also just to bring back to sort of what I was talking about earlier, a broad goal of ensuring access to universal health coverage will not guarantee access to quality services, and it will not guarantee reaching underserved populations. I think still that a lot of that work falls under organizations, civil society organizations such as our member associations that are going out with mobile health units and really trying to meet people where they are. I think it also doesn't eliminate the discrimination or social taboos that hinder access to care. In Mexico, for example, there's Seguro Popular, which extends health coverage to all its citizens, but we hear all the time from young people and other marginalized groups that they can't access these services. So just to kind of make that point about how really thinking about rights and where people are needs to be part of that conversation as well.
Great, thanks, Kelly. All right, we're up for 3 more questions. Jason here in the front, Kim there, and the woman in the red. And then I'll do this side after that.
Thank you to the panel. I'm Jason Bremner from Population Reference Bureau. I want to turn, I guess, to the targets and to some of the discussions that you had about inequalities. Right now we have a target, although it took us 5 years to get there afterwards, of universal access to SRH. And I see that really more as a declaration than as a target. It's certainly something we all strive for, but given the levels of access that exist now, was that realistic within the time frame of 2015? And moving forward for a 15-year period, is having a target of universal access that doesn't identify inequities or populations that particularly need attention, does that translate into action on the ground? Or does it just simply affirm our declaration to the importance and essential of SRH as a right? So that's just a thought.
Hi, my name is Kim Lovell. I'm with the Sierra Club's Global Population and Environment Program. A lot of the panelists mentioned or brought up at various times throughout your talks climate change and sustainable development and sort of the connections between SRHR and those issues. So I was kind of curious to hear from you all what you really see as the best points of entry for the environmental community to really engage in this issue. Is it in making sure that SRH is incorporated into environmental policies? Do you see more potential for the environment and sustainable development to be included in SRH policies? policies? Do you think more advocacy on the ground from environmental communities would be helpful? Sort of, what do you see as the best way to sort of maximize contribution from the environmental and sustainable development communities with regards to the issue of SRH? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Alka Basu. I'm at Cornell University and the UN Foundation right now. And I have a question which I don't know how we can address. I'm just troubled by it because we keep using the word rights, and we also occasionally append the word responsibilities to the word rights. And I wonder, we don't think enough about what we mean by that. At one level, the flip side of rights is responsibilities, in that someone has to be responsible for guaranteeing those rights, whether it's the state or the whatever the agency we're thinking of. And that part we do assume when we talk about rights, that we assume there's a state that's going to guarantee that rights, those rights. But what do we mean when we say the right to responsibly decide, for example? What we never clarified that. Whose responsibility and what responsibility? On what grounds is responsibility to be determined? Does it mean accountability? Does it mean taking personal responsibility for the expenses incurred in one's decisions? I don't know. I just wonder whether we should be even dissecting the philosophy behind those words like we talk about rights, only so that we have an answer when people challenge us on some of these issues. And finally, again, the other, rights is again a big word, and what do we do with things like conflicting rights, when the rights of one individual conflict with the rights of another? We assume when we talk about sexual rights that we're thinking in terms of gender, but there are usually other parties involved. And I just think that we need to at least intellectually, even if we can't immediately do anything on the ground, be clearer in our own minds about how we address some of these issues.
Yeah, three very different but really provocative questions. I won't go in order this time. I'll let you volunteer. John, Beth, or Kelly, who wants to step forward? John, please.
Yeah, I will start with the last question. Thank you, Alaka. It's a great question. If you remember, you go back to '68, there was a conference on population rights in Tehran, Iran. That's the first time that the concept of reproductive rights was crafted, I think. But in the same Tehran declaration, there is also the word responsibility. And I think we have never been able to put the two together so far. So I think you touch a raw nerve here, because we will have to confront that. Now, I try to explain that the world since '94, it's totally different. We are not going back to the target setting. We are not going back to the coercion, etc. That's something of the past. We live in a new world. And I think Bob Engelman got it right in his book More, that I would urge you to read. If you do what the women want, I think you do the right thing. You are going to be okay. So we are not going to enforce anything. However, we need somehow to draw a line in the sand and to say, what is the responsibility? Who is responsible for what? They are the individuals, they are the governments, they are the communities, they are the leaders. And I don't think that we have intellectually grappled with that so far. Now, this being said, I believe there are a common denominator of rights that we should not negotiate. When I go to Niger and I see the girl, 11 years old, who need a C-section because she was pregnant, and she had been married to a guy who is 20, 30 years older than her, etc. We cannot keep going with the child marriage. We have got to do something. So I think we must have at the international level, international communities, the consensus, and it's very difficult to do. when I was at the UN recently, a couple of months ago, we had, I think there are 50 different UN agencies. So even to bring the UN system to speak in one voice, it's a bit of a challenge. But there are a few things that we cannot negotiate. We cannot accept that there would be a girl raped in New Delhi and killed, and horrible other things happen to her as well. So we have to draw the line, and I think that's where we need to have a firm stand and commitment on what are the basic rights, human rights, that we need to proclaim, and we need to defend, and we need to really fight for eventually. I would also like to touch on a question by Jason. You raise a very important point. We all do fantastic declarations. We have commitments. We have Millennium Development Goals. And then what's the reality between the declaration and the reality? And again, I think we do need those commitment declarations, etc. But we do also need to have the means to make them a reality. And that's exactly what happened with the London Summit on family planning, Melinda Gates and DFID. And I think the London Summit came quite late, because the Gates Foundation was really thinking how we should go about it, and then Melinda Gates herself decided to really put her foot down, if you will, and to say we need to do it. But then this happened because we missed the boat in 2000, and then we had this target 5B in 2005, and then there has not been a real commitment and a real funding. So we have not been really making this commitment a reality when we had this target 5B eventually adopted in 2005. So to avoid that to happen again, we probably do need to make it work this time with the target, the London Summit. And there has been a tremendous amount of money, and there has been a lot of commitments. I think, John, you just mentioned that you come back from Senegal, and it's a kind of a new situation there because you have a champion in the person of the Minister of Health. So we have to do this work at the country level, and we have to identify the right champions, the right people. And maybe not talking about targets, but we might think about the programmatic goals, like increasing the CPR, contraceptive prevalence rate, by 1 percentage point or 1.5 percentage point per year. Even that is going to be a huge effort. The latest results of Niger, DHS, which are not official yet, it seems, show that in 6 years they have been able to bring the CPR from, let's say, 5 to 12%, which is amazing in a country like Niger when you think about it, because the lack of female education, the lack of empowerment of women. So we have to keep doing those efforts year after year after year, and country after country, especially in the high fertility countries where we are talking, and in the countries where the sexual rights, if I may use this word, are not guaranteed. I will stop here.
Thank you. And John's responded, at least in part, to our first and third question. So I'm going to ask Beth or Kelly if you have to take a stab at Kim's question around climate change and sustainable development, and then I'd love to open it back up for at least 2 or 3 more questions, even though we won't be able to answer them in full, just to get more ideas on the table.
I know Kelly can't see me, but I'll go ahead and jump in, Kelly, and leave room for you to join as well.
Okay.
The last time I was here at the Wilson Center was actually for an event in which Suzanne spoke, and during that event, USAID had one of their program officers who was here who spoke about a really interesting and innovative program that USAID is supporting, where this one in particular was in Madagascar, and it started as an environmental sustainability program that was there to protect the reefs and the fishing industry for the local people whose livelihoods were based on that. In doing that program, in talking to the people they were hoping to serve, what they found is that there was an incredibly high TFR. I think he mentioned that one woman had 26 children, which is really mind-boggling. But that the service that the people in that community most wanted was family planning and reproductive health, and they had to walk, again, an incredibly difficult distance to imagine in order to get those services. It was something like 30 miles. So they determined that to have the best impact on their program for climate change, that they needed to also have a family planning program that was tied to that. And they realized enormous success over a couple of years in terms of having a great impact on both. And so my thinking from hearing that is that at the local level, if these two communities could get together and talk about synergies, ways of working together to amplify the success of both of their programs, that you may find your best way in through those conversations. Because as always, it's the local communities who know what they need and who can guide you toward giving them the services that they best need in order to reach their own goals, which hopefully then will dovetail with yours. And then if I could quickly go back to the discussion of rights, and especially with regard to reproductive rights and what we're hoping to accomplish there. You know, the reason that we continue to bring these up and that they come up over and over again, and hopefully in new fora every year, like with Rio, where we really struggled, but also in the Human Rights Council last year, we had a maternal mortality resolution there that had reproductive rights language in it. We do these things and we invest in them as a government because we believe that we can hopefully, as I said, keep these normative standards moving forward, bring in and refresh our thinking in new ways on different issues, bring in perspectives from the field, and in doing so, empower advocates who can then hold their own governments accountable for reaching or for doing the programs that they agreed to or for achieving the goals that they agreed to through these UN processes. So we understand that that can be incredibly frustrating and not always in a forward trajectory, and sometimes we have these goals that do end up being more aspirational at the end of the day. But I think that those conversations that we continue to slog through at the UN and through other international fora will hopefully move forward, although very slowly it seems, international norms and standards so that there's this consensus around where we want to be. It takes an incredibly long time to get there, but I can't think of a better alternative than all of us sitting around the table and talking about where we want to be at the end of the day. And I hope that that's meaningful for your work in some way, and as always, we are happy to hear from you about the ways that we can better represent what you're seeing in the field and where you think that these policies should be going. That's very helpful to us.
Thank you, Beth. And Kelly, I know you can't see the energy in the room, so I'm gonna move back to a couple of questions. I hope you don't mind that I'm not giving you a chance at this stage to answer those three. And I promised I would take a few more questions from this side of the room, and then we will move to close. And I saw 3 hands, 1, 2, and 3. Starting either way, actually, you can start either at the back or the front. I won't make you make it.
I got it first. We've heard an enormous amount this morning.
Introduce yourself if you could.
Hazel Denton. I'm at Georgetown with Professor May. We've heard a lot this morning about the importance of coordinating and integrating and how we should get rid of a silo mentality. And in this respect, Beth's recent answer on how climate change and family planning can be linked was really music to my ears. And my question is in the same vein to you, Beth. PEPFAR, what is the potential for adding SRH to PEPFAR's mandate? Can we, it fits, can we somehow get PEPFAR to also look at family planning and SRH? Thank you.
Great question, Hazel. Thank you.
Susan Newcomer from NICHD. Hazel took my question.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Redner, and I'm here with the International Women's Health Coalition. I just wanted to start off by thanking you for your presentations, and particularly the emphasis that each of you placed on the human rights of women and girls and young people, and particularly the most vulnerable young people and women that we find in the world today. Also about the recognition, we don't often see this in Washington, but the recognition of the complexity and multiple dimensions that comprise sexual and reproductive health. We often see some of these issues either being only looked at through the lens of maternal mortality or maternal health, or through family planning as the panacea, or et cetera. So, you know, having that recognition here, in particular with this discussion, I thought was quite important. I also wanted to reflect a little bit about the MDGs 5 and 5 be and really reiterate what an impact that has had from an advocacy perspective here in Washington and internationally, having reproductive health as a subset of maternal health, which those of us know that it's family planning, maternal health, reproductive health comprise different services and different information, et cetera, although everyone deserves all of that information. So my question is this. So, given the complexity from domestic violence to maternal health to family planning, if we were to have a goal on sexual reproductive health or have a health goal with SRH as a piece of that, how can we ensure that issues around population dynamics such as total fertility rate, contraceptive prevalence rate, how do we ensure that both the complexity of SRH is represented among the indicators? We know that what's measured is funded, so we need, or theoretically, so we want to make sure that what we're measuring is actually reflecting the complexity of the issue, but that we remain rights-based as well, and ensuring that we don't boil the achievement of women and girls' sexual and reproductive health and rights simply to contraceptive prevalence rate or total fertility rates? And what are some of the other indicators that would reflect both the human rights-based approach and also the complexity of sexual and reproductive health? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So 3 individuals and really only 2 questions. Kelly, I'm going to start with you, and of course in the crazy world of technology, Kelly can see me and the room, so you knew that there was a lot of people here asking good questions. So Kelly, do you want to take a stab at anything that's been laid out either in the previous set of 3 questions or these 2?
Excellent questions, and hi, Jen Redner. I can't see you, but hi. I just to comment on what Jen said about kind of siloizing, that's not a word, but ensuring like a comprehensive approach to sexual and reproductive rights and health. Cairo had, at the time, a very comprehensive definition of what those essential services were, and it's contraception, it's programs and policies to prevent violence against women and girls, it's testing and treatment for sexually transmitted infections, care during pregnancy and birth. And I think the kind of that these don't always trajectorize into the subsequent agreements. And I think looking at that comprehensive suite of services and really evaluating what's changed, for one, the rising number of HIV infections among women and girls. I mean, if you look at that and kind of the issue of sexual rights, you have a very strong starting point to come up with that suite of services, rather than, just looking at contraceptive prevalence, which I agree is not a full view of what needs to be done to ensure people's health and rights. So just to kind of add to Jen's comment, I think that's it. And I'm very curious about PEPFAR as well. So
that's great. And then Beth, would you like to go next?
Well, actually, I'd prefer if somebody else in this room would answer this, but I'm not going to put her on the spot, so I'll do my best to paraphrase what I've learned through the participation of others in those negotiations or discussions among PEPFAR and others about including SRH. And it's my understanding that as of last November or so, with this, there was a declaration that put forth that there could be a connection with PEPFAR funding to reproductive health programs, but that the purchase of contraceptive commodities was still limited outside of the purchase of condoms. So I think that there was a big step forward. There's obviously room for continued dialogue around that, and I think that you can't underestimate the impact of the enormous pressure and the good thinking and the research that people in this room and your organizations have put forward over time to try to get us at least to this point. And then we'll hope for continued progress in time to come. Jen, I think that your comment about the MDGs and how they frame or allow sexual and reproductive health to be framed under the umbrella of maternal mortality is so important, because we see that over and over again. Maternal mortality is obviously, as a framework, something that everybody is behind. Everybody wants to reduce it anyway. And it makes it sort of an easier sell for SRH. But I think that we need to really flip that on its head in order to have the impact that we really want. And that we need to be able to stand up and say that SRH in and of itself, and particularly reproductive rights, are what we're fighting for, and that maternal mortality is one of the indicators within that. So, again, your voices in that conversation are very important, and I encourage you to keep expressing that so that we end up where we want to be at the end of the day. But when it comes to capturing that complexity, I know that there's also a lot of discussion about how to the extent that they were effective, the MDGs were seen as being a good sell because they were simple and clear and easy to understand, which then makes it difficult to build in that complexity around data collection and all of those other indicators that need to go under it in order to have successful programs. So I think that the framework may come out as being something easy to remember and easy to conceptualize, and maybe a lot of the thought that goes in behind that will come out in the papers that are put forward, but may not be reflected in just the simple language that comes forward from that. So I hope so, though, and I know that I've seen a lot of, in the frameworks that I've seen put forward, there is a strong call for data and for these to be fact-based decisions. So hopefully that'll be reflected in some meaningful way.
Thank you. And John, 1 or 2 minutes in our remaining time here altogether.
Yeah, would like to go back to the MDGs in 2000. I think the world was kind of different at the time. It's now about 22 years in the past, and I think the MDGs missed two major things. One is the Target 5B, of course, that we have mentioned again and again, that was put back in 2005, but also I think the MDGs put the sole emphasis on primary education, and when we should have also an emphasis on secondary education. I think that was a shortcoming of the MDGs. And in the new framework, I'm sure that there will be a pitch for secondary education, and because we cannot keep going with just providing primary education to everyone, it's not good enough, especially as the technology changes, as the economy becomes more globalized despite the Great Recession. And I also believe that in the next MDGs there will be a much stronger flavor, I hope so, on rights, which has not been there very much in the past framework. So, and all the work that you are all doing, the civil society and in every quarters, I think it's important to bring that consensus on rights, bring that to bear. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, before I hand it over to Sandeep for quick closing comments, thank you. I think we had a great 2 hours together. Thanks for taking time out of your day. We teased out some difficult and complicated issues, so I want to say thank you to the audience, but especially to the panelists for being willing to take those issues on and put forward an honest and candid response as you can. I think we, in terms of advocacy and action, we heard some important reminders about the value and strength of international networks and how we support those, and we also got some marching orders for work here in D.C., and there's a lot of us who really focus on Washington, D.C. policy, and there's lots to do in these next 2 and 4 years. ECSP should thank us. You have ideas for at least the next 2 or 3 panels. Happy to help you articulate those later. And a reminder that so much of what we heard today really only happens if we engage in partnership and collaboration and dialogue. And I know to some that sounds sort of soft. It sounds like you're just talking, but it's hard work if you actually do it well, and you really act on what you learn from each other and from the tough stuff that your colleagues tell you and you hear. So just to say in 2013, let's make it a joint resolution to do more of that and to do it in a way that really matters. And then John, I want to just sort of thank you for the note that I want to end on, which is he said at some point that if you do what women want, based on Bob Bingelman's book, you get it right. And so if we take that from the global to the household back to the global level, I mean, I think we kind of have our agenda figured out. So thank you for that. Yep, Sandeep.
I actually just wanted to encourage everybody to continue to have this conversation as well. You can do that by visiting our website, which is wilsoncenter.org, or our blog, which is newsecuritybeat.org. And I wanted to thank you for making the discussion great, and of course for making my job substantially easier with the list of the next number of sessions that we'll try to host here at the center. And I wanted you to join me in thanking our wonderful moderator and speakers today.
Could have gone for another hour, probably, you know?